You were never meant to know this. Beneath the quiet fields of Delaware, the earth keeps secrets, screams buried so deep most would never hear them, but some secrets claw their way to the surface. In 1834, a farmer guiding his plow felt his horse stumble, sinking into soil that shouldn't have been soft. The plow struck something hard, wooden, buried. He dug. A chest emerged, warped, blackened, and heavy. When he pried it open, the stench of decay hit him. Inside was a skull, teeth broken, temples shattered. A life ended violently. This was no accident. It was the work of the predator, a woman who had mastered fear, cruelty, and control. For decades, she ran a network that kidnapped free African Americans and escaped slaves, selling them south into bondage. She turned human lives into currency, silenced anyone who threatened her, and buried her victims beneath taverns, farms, and the very soil itself. Delaware's forests, swamps, and hidden roads gave her perfect cover. Law enforcement was sparse, corrupt, or easily fooled. Neighbors whispered about missing travelers, but fear and indifference kept them silent. She understood power, how to seize it, manipulate it, and enforce it without leaving a trace. This is not a story of crime. It's a story of a system that allowed evil to flourish. Laws, politics, and societal prejudice created a stage for her reign. And now, you are stepping onto it. Once you see what she built, what she destroyed, and what society ignored, you'll understand why this chapter of Delaware's history feels forbidden. This isn't entertainment. It's a descent into darkness too real to teach. Once you see it, you will never unsee it. The Delaware-Maryland border in the early 1800s was a shadow world, a place where law had no teeth, and isolation became the predator's greatest ally. Swamps swallowed footprints, pine forests muffled screams, dirt roads vanished into marshes, leaving travelers and locals alike exposed to forces they could neither see nor understand. Here she ruled. At the heart of this wilderness stood her tavern, a warm glow from its windows masking horrors below. Beneath creaking floorboards lay a labyrinth of hidden rooms, tunnels, and cells designed to imprison human beings like livestock. At night, muffled cries seeped through cracks in the wood, unheard by those drinking and laughing above. Every hidden chamber was a testament to her precision, a machine built to control fear itself. She was no mindless killer. Born decades earlier, her origins shrouded in mystery, she transformed over the years into a master strategist. Ordinary women passed through her world, but she became extraordinary, predatory, cunning, and unrelenting. She identified vulnerability, exploited isolation, and weaponized society's blindness to her advantage. Her victims were not random. Free African Americans, escaped slaves, even children, those who could be molded or sold, were meticulously targeted. She understood that the law would ignore them, that society would turn away. Their lives were not valued, and in this void, she built her empire. This was not chaos. It was organized terror. She studied the land, the economy, the human psyche, and used every advantage. Delaware's forests, rivers, and hidden paths were not just terrain, they were tools in her arsenal. Every abduction, every disappearance, every secret burial reinforced her control. What you must understand is this: the predator's reign was not merely a crime story. It was a reflection of a society that allowed evil to flourish when it looked the other way. She thrived because she understood the weaknesses in the system and exploited them with surgical precision. By the 1830s, the predator had evolved from a shadow in the woods to the architect of a network no one dared name aloud. She did not act alone. Her operations depended on accomplices, men and women who understood that power, profit, and terror could be intertwined. Each member of her network had a role. Some scouted for vulnerable targets, others transported captives, while a select few ensured that whispers of their crimes never reached ears that could interfere. Her methods were precise, calculated, and ruthless. She preyed on desperation, offering employment, guidance, or opportunity to those who trusted her, only to strip them of freedom and identity. Families lost children without warning. Young adults vanished while walking along familiar roads, and escaped slaves were trapped in a web so meticulously constructed that escape was almost impossible. The predator understood psychology as well as geography. She broke her victims slowly, systematically eroding hope. Chains and hidden rooms were just the beginning. She removed proof of identity, renamed those she captured, and obliterated any trace of their previous lives. Resistance was met with violence, compliance with calculated reward. Fear became a tool, shaping behavior, ensuring silence, and perpetuating obedience. Her empire extended far beyond her tavern or farm. Secret routes connected distant towns, rivers, and forests, creating a web of transit invisible to law enforcement. Letters and coded messages ensured that no step was taken without oversight, no error left uncorrected. Each disappearance, each sale to southern buyers, reinforced her position and tightened the grip of terror. And yet, she remained almost untouchable. Corruption, indifference, and systemic blind spots were her allies. The law existed but rarely interfered. Communities whispered, but fear kept them silent. She thrived in the spaces between authority, exploiting every loophole, every weakness, every lapse of conscience. This is the reality they never teach. That one person, armed with cunning, patience, and a ruthless understanding of human nature, could build an empire of fear, and that society itself often enables the predator more than it resists her. The predator's empire was not built on chance, it was built on information. She and her network meticulously tracked families, workers, and escapees, noting who was vulnerable, who could be lured, and who could fetch the highest price. Every detail mattered: a young adult with no close family, a family struggling to survive, a child alone in the fields. These were opportunities she exploited with surgical precision. Her kidnappings were calculated performances. She would approach with the guise of opportunity, a job, safe passage, or protection. Trust was the weapon she wielded first, and once they fell for it, there was no turning back. Victims were transported through hidden paths, rivers and woods. Blindfolds, chains, and threats ensured obedience. Hours, days, sometimes weeks passed in darkness. Every moment a calculated push toward psychological submission. Upon arrival at her tavern or remote property, the predator had prepared the next stage: captivity. Hidden rooms, reinforced walls, and underground tunnels turned homes and businesses into prisons. Chains anchored to stone, small ventilation shafts to keep prisoners alive, yet isolated and powerless. She understood that fear alone could bend the mind, and she applied it systematically. Hunger, exhaustion, and the constant uncertainty of survival became instruments of control. Her intelligence network ensured that no one slipped through. Scouts moved ahead, checking for law enforcement, curious neighbors, or anyone who might interfere. Letters in code, signals, and secret schedules maintained coordination across miles of wilderness. Even the smallest misstep could compromise an operation, and she punished errors ruthlessly, reinforcing obedience through example. What made her terrifying was her foresight. She anticipated patterns, predicted reactions, and manipulated outcomes. Victims weren't merely captured. They were processed. Identities erased, personal belongings destroyed, histories rewritten. Any resistance was crushed. Compliance was rewarded with mere survival. The predator's operations were a chilling reminder. Fear, intelligence, and ruthlessness, combined, can create a power structure that thrives on the weakness and silence of society. Her empire was invisible to those who didn't look, unstoppable to those who did not understand, and unchallenged by a world unwilling to see. Beneath the predator's tavern and remote properties, darkness was absolute. No sunlight, no warmth, just the chill of stone and wood, the metallic smell of chains, and the quiet despair of those trapped. Men, women, and children were kept in separate chambers, each carefully designed to prevent escape. The walls absorbed screams, the floors swallowed footsteps, and the air carried the oppressive weight of fear. She understood that physical confinement alone was insufficient. Psychological domination was her true weapon. Victims were systematically stripped of identity, names erased, histories destroyed, personal belongings taken. They were given numbers, labels, false backgrounds, anything that severed their connection to life before capture. Compliance was enforced with pain, punishment, and the constant threat of being sold deeper into bondage, further from hope or rescue. Food was scarce, water rationed. The predator watched closely, noting reactions, weaknesses, and resilience. Every hunger pang, every groan, every whispered prayer became a tool to break their will. Resistance was met with brutality. Even minor defiance could result in beatings or worse. Silence, despair, and obedience were carefully cultivated. The network she commanded ensured that no cry for help would travel beyond the walls. Scouts patrolled surrounding woods, checking roads and waterways. Signals were sent if outsiders approached, and operations paused until the threat passed. Every movement was calculated, every prisoner's step controlled, every outcome preordained. Yet even in this darkness, she was clever. She recognized that fear alone was not enough. Prisoners had to believe escape was impossible. Blindfolds, isolation, and threats of immediate death reinforced the narrative. She created a world where hope itself became a dangerous illusion. The predator's underground cells were more than prisons. They were classrooms in terror, laboratories of obedience. They taught a brutal lesson: power is absolute, and those who underestimate it pay the highest price. Those who survived bore the scars not only of chains and blows, but of a mind reshaped by fear. This is the world she ruled. Invisible to most, unstoppable to those who tried to resist, unchallenged by a society unwilling to look, and it was only the beginning. The predator understood that fear could only carry you so far. Power required infrastructure, allies, and reach. She extended her influence beyond the isolated woods and rivers of Delaware, connecting with men and women who understood the value of secrecy and profit. Networks of accomplices, some willing, some coerced, moved like shadows across the region. Each person served a purpose: scouts who identified targets, transporters who moved victims quietly, and corrupt officials who looked the other way when necessary. Her empire was structured with precision. Messages traveled in code, appointments were hidden in plain sight, and routes were altered constantly to avoid detection. A missing child here, a vanished worker there. No one outside the network suspected a pattern, yet each disappearance was a thread in her tapestry of terror. The predator had calculated every risk, every contingency, every human factor. Delaware's geographic isolation became a tool. Swamps slowed pursuit, dense forests concealed movement, and rivers allowed silent transportation. She knew the law would struggle to follow, that neighbors would rarely intervene, and that fear would keep witnesses silent. This was a landscape molded to her advantage, exploited with meticulous care. And she thrived because she studied human behavior. She knew who would speak, who would flee, who could be manipulated, and who would betray. She exploited familial bonds, economic desperation, and the natural trust of her victims, turning human instincts against them. By the time anyone realized the danger, it was already too late. Her reach was not limited to Delaware. Rumors, coded letters, and hidden networks stretched her influence into Maryland, Pennsylvania, and beyond. Each connection strengthened her operation. Each partnership expanded her capacity for abduction and control. She was a master of logistics in an era when most criminals relied on luck and brute force. This expansion was not just ambition, it was mastery. The predator created an ecosystem where fear, obedience, and silence fueled her empire, and the world outside, it remained oblivious, unseeing, untouched, until it encountered the first cracks in her carefully constructed domain. The first abductions were deceptively simple, almost mundane, an illusion of normalcy masking terror. The predator would identify her victims with painstaking care: a family struggling to make ends meet, a young adult seeking work, an escaped slave desperate for freedom. Each presented an opportunity, each a target chosen for maximum leverage and minimum resistance. She never relied on brute force alone. Deception was her weapon. Promises of employment, protection, or safe passage were offered, luring victims into trust before it was ripped away. Parents believed they were sending their children to better lives. Workers thought they were accepting honest jobs. Only when it was too late did the predator's true design reveal itself. Once captured, victims were moved with precision. Blindfolds, chains, and threats ensured obedience, while secret routes, hidden paths, and nighttime travel minimized risk of exposure. Each step was orchestrated to instill fear, to convince them that escape was impossible, Hours turned to days, days to weeks, each moment designed to weaken resolve and break the spirit. Her ingenuity extended to the architecture of captivity. Hidden rooms, underground tunnels, and reinforced chambers transformed ordinary homes and taverns into prisons. Soundproof walls, concealed entrances, and ventilation shafts ensured captives could survive, yet remain trapped, isolated, and disoriented. Every detail was calculated. Escape became a fantasy, resistance a death sentence. Even her accomplices were carefully managed. Scouts and couriers moved with coordination, ensuring that each transport, each abduction, and each concealment proceeded flawlessly. Corrupt officials, bribed or coerced, looked the other way, their silence purchased with cash or fear. The predator's network was a living organism, each part essential to sustaining her reign. Witnesses rarely survived. Those who did learned that defiance carried consequences. The predator's lessons were harsh but effective. Compliance ensured survival, resistance guaranteed destruction. Through fear, intelligence, and ruthless strategy, she turned simple abduction into a science of control. This was the moment when terror became systematic, not random violence, but a meticulously executed campaign, one that would haunt Delaware and beyond for years. And yet, the world outside still remained oblivious to the predator's calculated cruelty. Once the victims were secured, the predator's true craft emerged. She did not merely confine them, she rewrote their existence. Names were stripped away, histories obliterated, connections severed. Every personal item, every token of identity was confiscated or destroyed. She understood that a person without a name, without memory, without recognition, was easier to control. The underground cells were classrooms of terror. Blindfolds, chains, darkness, and isolation were not just physical restraints, they were psychological weapons. Hours, days, weeks of deprivation reshaped minds, replacing hope with fear, resistance with obedience. Those who questioned, who remembered, who defied, were punished publicly, reinforcing compliance in others. The predator's methods were surgical. She knew which fears to exploit, which weaknesses to provoke, which instincts to manipulate. Hunger, exhaustion, and constant uncertainty were tools, honed to perfection over decades. Even fleeting acts of hope or defiance were countered with immediate reminders of her absolute control. Survival became a calculus. Obey, remain silent, accept the predator's world. Any attempt to assert individuality or resist was met with violence or threats of permanent separation. Captives learned quickly that their lives were fragile, disposable, and entirely in her hands. The predator's psychological mastery ensured that they internalized her dominance before any rescue could intervene. Her network extended this manipulation. Scouts monitored behavior, couriers enforced schedules, and corrupt officials ensured no interference. Each step was part of a meticulously planned system, every interaction designed to reinforce the predator's power. She controlled not just bodies but minds, shaping reality itself for those trapped in her empire. Through this relentless process, she achieved what few criminals could. The total domination of her victims, a transformation so complete that survival meant surrendering the self. Resistance became unthinkable, hope became a fragile illusion, and identity itself was reduced to a tool she could manipulate at will. This is the world she created, a labyrinth of fear, control, and erasure. And the most chilling part, the wider society remained largely unaware, allowing the predator to operate freely, unseen, untouchable, and unchallenged. The predator knew that power was amplified by control over space. Delaware's dense forests, marshy lands, and winding rivers were not obstacles. They were instruments of dominion. Every path, every stream, every isolated farmstead became a thread in her intricate network. She moved unseen, always calculating, always anticipating, turning the land itself into an ally. Taverns were not merely businesses, they were hubs of her operation. A warm fire and a welcoming smile masked the horrors below. Hidden rooms and subterranean tunnels transformed these ordinary structures into prisons and coordination centers. Travelers entered seeking food and lodging, some left with a sense of safety, while others became part of her carefully managed empire. The predator understood that perception was as powerful as force itself. Rivers and hidden roads allowed her network to move captives across counties and states with near invisibility. Scouts identified the quietest routes, avoiding neighbors and lawmen. Wagons carried victims to secret holding areas or to distant buyers. Each trip was a choreography of secrecy, timed and executed with precision. Even small towns remained unaware, their routine lives shielding her operations from scrutiny. Her strategy extended to jurisdictional boundaries. Delaware and Maryland, two states intersecting at her stronghold, became tools in her design. When authorities from one state approached, she could exploit legal loopholes by moving across the border. The Predator's empire thrived in these gaps between law and geography. She weaponized borders, using the system's complexity to protect her crimes. Every building, every path, every natural feature was catalogued and repurposed. Forests concealed movements, rivers transported captives, taverns held them, and borders shielded her from prosecution. It was not chaos. It was architecture, strategy, and calculated terror. The Predator's genius lay not just in her cruelty but in her vision. She built an infrastructure that supported fear, obedience, and profit. She controlled information, movement, and perception, ensuring that every element of the landscape served her purpose. Her network was a living organism, each part dependent on the other, each extension of her unrelenting power. This is the dark intelligence of the Predator, to dominate through geography, manipulation, and strategic design, creating an empire that few could see and even fewer could challenge. The Predator did not rely solely on fear to maintain her empire. She understood loyalty as a weapon. Accomplices were carefully selected, tested, and controlled. She ensured that every member of her network owed their survival, reputation, or profit directly to her. In doing so, she created bonds stronger than contracts, forged in the crucible of necessity and fear. Trust was transactional, yet deceptive. Accomplices who questioned her methods or showed hesitation were reminded, often violently, of the cost of disobedience. Public punishments were lessons for the entire network, reinforcing obedience through observation. Compliance was survival, defiance guaranteed elimination. Her psychology was clear. Every person under her influence understood their dependence and the Predator's absolute power. Manipulation extended beyond fear. She exploited ambition, greed, and desire for protection, creating incentives for cooperation. Members of her network were given roles that promised reward, status, or freedom in exchange for service. This duality of carrot and stick made her control absolute. Every action, every decision, every loyalty measured against the invisible weight of her authority. Threats were eliminated before they could grow. Competitors, informants, and potential whistleblowers faced swift and brutal consequences. No hesitation, no mercy. Each action was calculated to send a message. The Predator tolerated no dissent, no error, no independent ambition that could undermine her. Her reputation alone was a psychological weapon, spreading fear through rumor as efficiently as through direct action. Even her most trusted aides operated in a constant state of vigilance. They understood that failure, secrecy breaches, or perceived weakness could lead to immediate reprisal. This tension was not accidental, it was strategic. By keeping her network on edge, she ensured obedience, vigilance, and efficiency. Every person became an extension of her will, operating not only under orders, but under the unspoken knowledge of her reach and ruthlessness. The Predator's genius was her ability to manipulate minds as deftly as she controlled bodies. Loyalty, fear, ambition, and survival instincts were woven into a tapestry of obedience. Her empire was maintained not just by chains and hidden rooms, but by the calculated domination of thought, choice, and human behavior itself. In this world, the Predator was the ultimate architect, unseen, untouchable, and psychologically sovereign. Those who followed her did so not merely out of fear, but because they understood that she had mastered the human mind as fully as she had mastered the land. The Predator's first major capture was not a random act, it was a demonstration of her mastery over intelligence, logistics, and human psychology. She had identified her target weeks in advance, a young woman known for her independence and defiance, someone who could not be easily controlled. Every detail of her life was catalogued, Her routines, the people she trusted, the road she traveled, even the smallest habits that could be exploited. Her scouts monitored her movements, noting every deviation from routine. Couriers relayed information with precision, ensuring that the predator always remained steps ahead. By the time the abduction occurred, every contingency had been accounted for. Guards were in position, escape routes mapped, and contingencies for law enforcement prepared. She treated the operation like a military campaign, not a simple crime. The victim was approached under the guise of assistance, a friendly face, a plausible offer, a promise of opportunity. Trust was weaponized, and it worked. When she followed the lure, the trap closed seamlessly. Blindfolds, chains, and threats of immediate violence ensured compliance without the chaos of struggle. The predator's presence was always felt, even when unseen, a psychological dominance reinforced by preparation and intimidation. Once secured, the victim was moved with surgical precision. Hidden routes, secret river paths, and isolated backroads ensured no exposure. The predator's team operated like clockwork, each member aware of their role and the stakes involved. Coordination was absolute, communication silent, and execution flawless. Escape was inconceivable. Resistance was punished immediately. The psychological impact was as deliberate as the physical control. The victim was disoriented, isolated, and stripped of identity. Every interaction, every movement, every word spoken was designed to enforce the predator's dominance. It was a symphony of terror, planning, manipulation, and execution harmonized into absolute control. This first major capture set the standard for every operation that followed. It proved the predator's methodology, the efficiency of her network, and the terrifying reality of her reach. Her victims were not merely prisoners, they were subjects in a meticulously controlled experiment in fear, obedience, and survival. And as the first chains rattled in her hidden rooms, the predator's reputation began to spread, unseen yet unavoidable. Those who glimpsed her power understood that resistance was dangerous and survival depended on obedience. In this dark, hidden world, she had proven she was unstoppable. The predator understood that fear alone could not sustain an empire. She needed reach. Recruitment became her next weapon. New accomplices were selected not merely for strength or cunning, but for loyalty, pliability, and usefulness. Some were desperate, some ambitious, and some coerced. All were carefully molded to serve her will. Each addition increased her operational capacity, extending the shadow of her control further across Delaware and into neighboring states. Connections were cultivated with precision. Taverns, inns, and trading posts became informal recruitment grounds. Outsiders, travelers, and local opportunists were evaluated, tested, and folded into her network if they met her standards, or eliminated if they didn't. Every new member carried both potential profit and risk, and the predator balanced these with ruthless calculation. She rewarded success and punished failure, instilling an unspoken hierarchy built on fear, dependence, and opportunity. Her reach was no longer limited to local roads or border crossings. Maryland, Pennsylvania, and even southern states became nodes in her operation. Couriers transported intelligence and captives with disciplined secrecy. Hidden caches, safe houses, and coded signals ensured the smooth movement of both information and human cargo. She was no longer a solitary predator. She had created a decentralized, efficient, and deadly network that functioned with frightening autonomy under her command. The predator also leveraged existing social structures. Corrupt officials, merchants, and local laborers were folded into her system through bribery, threats, or mutual interest. Every interaction, every transaction was a potential extension of her empire. Communities unknowingly participated, their indifference or complicity further strengthening her dominion. She understood that real power came not just from direct control, but from shaping the environment itself. Her methods were evolving. Simple abductions became coordinated campaigns. Intelligence gathering, logistical planning, and psychological manipulation were integrated into a singular, disciplined strategy. No detail was too small to escape notice, no deviation from plan tolerated. Through precision, ruthlessness, and foresight, the predator transformed chaos into order and fear into obedience. By the mid-1830s, her empire had grown into a sophisticated machine of terror and control. Delaware remained the nucleus, but her influence radiated outward, touching multiple states, dozens of communities, and countless lives. The predator was no longer merely a criminal. She was an architect of systematic horror, operating with intelligence, patience, and chilling foresight. Transportation was not merely a means of moving captives. It was an extension of the predator's psychological assault. Every journey was designed to disorient, to instill fear, and to erode the sense of self. Blindfolds obscured the world. Chains reminded captives of their helplessness. Days on rough roads, nights in unfamiliar forests, and the constant uncertainty of what lay ahead created a mental prison even before physical confinement began. The predator understood that fear could be weaponized. Whispered threats, sudden bursts of violence, and carefully timed displays of dominance reminded captives that escape was unimaginable. Each step of the journey reinforced the inevitability of her control. Those who resisted were punished swiftly, their suffering observed by others as a warning. Compliance was survival, defiance was annihilation. Isolation was strategic. Captives were often separated, deprived of contact with others who might offer comfort or reassurance. This fractured any emerging solidarity, leaving each person trapped not just physically, but emotionally and mentally. Hope became a dangerous illusion, a fleeting thought that the predator crushed before it could grow. She also exploited uncertainty. Victims never knew where they were going, how long the journey would last, or who might be watching. This constant unpredictability created a heightened state of anxiety, keeping them submissive and alert. The predator's network communicated through coded signals, ensuring that captives were always under surveillance, even when she herself was not present. Food, water, and rest were rationed to maximize obedience. Every provision came with a reminder of dependence, every withheld comfort a reinforcement of vulnerability. The predator transformed basic survival needs into instruments of control, teaching captives that their lives were entirely subject to her will. By the time they arrived at holding facilities or hidden rooms, the victims were already mentally broken. Chains might bind their bodies, but fear, exhaustion, and despair bound their minds. The predator had created not just prisoners but compliant subjects, psychologically conditioned to accept her dominance without question. This is how she mastered control over life and mind. Each journey, each subtle manipulation, each carefully orchestrated act of terror contributed to a network of obedience that extended far beyond physical confinement. In the predator's hands, transportation was more than movement. It was a crucible of terror, shaping captives into instruments of her empire. The predator's first large-scale operation was a chilling display of meticulous planning and ruthless efficiency. This was no longer a single victim. This was an entire community of targets, selected for their vulnerability and value. Every detail was mapped, every movement anticipated, every possible contingency accounted for. She orchestrated the operation like a general preparing for battle, her mind a blueprint of fear and control. Weeks before the abduction, scouts were dispatched to observe routines. Who rose early, who traveled alone, who could be persuaded or coerced. The predator left nothing to chance. Couriers relayed intelligence quickly and silently, ensuring that her team remained synchronized. When the moment came, every participant knew their role and the precise timing required. Chaos was eliminated, precision reigned. The night of the operation was calculated for maximum psychological impact. Captives were approached under deceptive pretenses, friendly faces, false opportunities, and promises of safety masked the trap. The predator's team moved like shadows, efficient and silent, minimizing resistance while maximizing terror. Chains, blindfolds, and whispered threats ensured immediate submission. Obedience was instant, fear was total. Transportation of multiple captives demanded logistical mastery. Wagons were carefully arranged, routes mapped to avoid detection, and contingencies prepared for any unexpected interference. River paths, hidden roads, and isolated clearings were used strategically, ensuring that the operation proceeded without interruption. Each movement reinforced the predator's omnipotence. Escape was unthinkable, rescue unlikely, submission inevitable. Psychological manipulation was as precise as the physical control. Victims were stripped of their names, separated from companions, and subjected to constant uncertainty. Fear was amplified by darkness, isolation, and the constant presence of armed enforcers. Even those who had previously resisted submission found themselves conforming, their minds reshaped by relentless terror. By dawn, the predator's empire had expanded. Multiple victims were secured, moved to hidden locations, and processed according to her established methods. Intelligence, logistics, and psychological control had converged flawlessly. She demonstrated not only power but strategy, the ability to manipulate human behavior, geography, and law simultaneously. This operation marked a turning point. The predator was no longer a localized threat. She had become a regional force of control and fear. Her network now functioned as a coordinated machine, capable of executing complex, multi-state operations with chilling precision. Those who underestimated her would soon learn that she was not merely a criminal. She was an architect of terror, a master of manipulation, and an unseen force shaping lives across the borderlands. Arrival at the predator's hidden facilities was only the beginning of the torment. Captives were moved from the chaos of transport into meticulously controlled environments designed to break both body and mind. Darkness, confinement, and constant surveillance stripped away any remaining sense of autonomy. Every detail of the room, the chains, the sparse furnishings, the ventilation that allowed just enough air to breathe, was calculated to enforce obedience. The predator understood the fragility of the human psyche. She reinforced dominance through ritualized procedures. Food was distributed with a commanding presence, movement was dictated, and any hint of defiance was punished swiftly and publicly. Silence was enforced not merely by chains, but by fear of retribution, fear that extended beyond the physical, embedding itself deep into thought. Isolation amplified submission. Captives were often separated from anyone they knew, preventing collaboration or hope derived from solidarity. The predator used this isolation to her advantage, instilling the idea that survival depended entirely on compliance. Even whispers of escape were extinguished, their very existence treated as a threat to her carefully constructed order. The predator's methods were psychological as much as physical. She stripped captives of their identities, erasing names and past histories, replacing them with labels dictated by her control. Compliance became their new identity. Resistance became unimaginable. Over time, fear transformed into learned behavior, a constant subconscious acceptance of her absolute authority. Communication among captives was restricted and monitored. Any attempts to resist mentally or verbally were met with immediate correction. The predator ensured that the message was clear, disobedience would not be tolerated, and her reach extended beyond sight. The rules were absolute, there, and the consequences immediate. By enforcing this psychological regime, the predator created more than captives. She created subjects, conditioned to follow without question, their minds as controlled as their bodies. This mastery over human behavior was not accidental. It was the product of observation, experience, and a chilling understanding of human weakness. The hidden facilities were her laboratories of obedience. Every chain, every shadow, every command was part of a system designed to reshape thought and behavior. Victims were not merely imprisoned, they were meticulously reprogrammed to accept the predator's dominance as absolute. In this way, her empire grew not just in numbers, but in the depth of control over the very essence of life itself. The predator knew that control over victims alone was not enough. True power required influence over the world around her. She began embedding her operations into the very fabric of local communities, exploiting social systems and human indifference to shield her empire from scrutiny. This was not random corruption, it was strategic infiltration, turning towns, merchants, and officials into unwitting or complicit participants. Merchants and traders were her first point of leverage. Supplies, wagons, and labor could be procured with minimal questions when paid with cash or promises of protection. Some complied out of greed, others from fear, understanding that refusal could bring consequences that were as invisible as they were deadly. The predator turned simple transactions into instruments of obedience, embedding her influence in routine commerce. Law enforcement was manipulated through subtle intimidation and corruption. Few officers patrolled the remote borderlands, and those who did were often dependent on local goodwill. Bribes, threats, and carefully timed demonstrations of power ensured that authorities remained passive observers or active enablers. She engineered the perception that any investigation could be dangerous, unpredictable, or futile, cementing her untouchable reputation. Even neighbors were drawn into her orbit. Isolation and sparse communities meant that people often turned a blind eye to suspicious activity, rationalizing it as inconsequential or outside their concern. Some provided intelligence, others offered temporary shelter for wagons or livestock, and a few became active participants in her network. Through subtle influence, the predator blurred the line between complicity and survival. She was a master of perception. By controlling what people saw and what they believed, she created a fog of uncertainty that shielded her operations. No one could fully understand her reach, yet everyone felt its shadow. Fear, respect, and curiosity intertwined, ensuring that communities self-policed their responses to her empire, never fully realizing the magnitude of what was happening in plain sight. Her influence extended beyond immediate geography. Couriers, communication networks, and strategic placement of safe houses ensured that her empire touched multiple states, while local towns unknowingly facilitated her operations. Every layer of society became a tool, every system a means to maintain dominance. Through this network of social manipulation, the predator transformed fear into infrastructure, chaos into order, and indifference into protection. Her empire was no longer hidden merely in dark rooms or secret tunnels. It was embedded in the very patterns of life around her, invisible, untouchable, and ruthlessly effective. By the late 1830s, whispers of the predator's empire reached beyond the borderlands. Families who had lost loved ones began connecting the dots, and reports of disappearances trickled up to regional authorities. The predator's shadow was long, but it was never invisible, yet the scale of her operations, combined with local complicity and fear, made the truth difficult to grasp. Authorities in Delaware, Maryland, and Pennsylvania were initially cautious, constrained by jurisdictional boundaries and fragmented communication. When complaints surfaced, they were often dismissed, minimized, or deferred. Investigators encountered townspeople who were hesitant to speak, merchants who had been quietly co-opted, and officers whose loyalties or fears conflicted with duty. The predator had not only exploited the law, she had woven herself into the gaps and weaknesses of the system. The first serious investigation came after a high-profile disappearance near the border. A young man, last seen traveling between Delaware and Maryland, vanished without trace. Local authorities, pressured by prominent citizens, began to piece together connections to the predator's network. For the first time, investigators recognized a pattern. Isolated incidents were not random, they were coordinated, systematic, and linked to a single formidable figure. Couriers, tavern owners, and neighbors were interviewed under duress. Witnesses provided fragmented accounts of strange travelers, wagons moving at odd hours, and concealed rooms within seemingly ordinary buildings. Each testimony hinted at something far larger than a simple crime. It was an intricate web of abduction, exploitation, and murder. Yet fear prevented witnesses from speaking fully. Those who dared to share details risked retaliation from an unseen hand. The predator's awareness of these investigations only strengthened her control. She shifted operations subtly, relocating safe houses, changing transport routes, and reinforcing loyalty among her accomplices. She understood that perception was as powerful as action. By appearing untouchable and omnipresent, she manipulated both victims and investigators alike, sowing doubt and hesitation at every level. Despite these challenges, the first serious probe revealed cracks in her network. Intelligence began to accumulate, names, routes, and hidden properties were noted. Investigators were learning the structure of an empire built on fear, secrecy, and meticulous planning. The predator had created an intricate fortress of human control, yet the first glimmers of resistance began to emerge, setting the stage for a confrontation that would test the limits of her cunning and the courage of those seeking justice. The predator sensed the tightening grip of investigation like a shadow creeping across her domain. Rather than retreat, she escalated. Violence became both weapon and message. Every act was calculated to intimidate witnesses, silence dissent, and remind both her captives and the surrounding communities that resistance carried a price far higher than compliance. Abductions became bolder, executed with swiftness and precision, designed to send ripples of terror. Captives were now moved more frequently, their routes constantly altered to confound investigators. Safe houses were reinforced, hidden entrances expanded, and guards trained in intimidation tactics. She transformed every corner of her network into a mechanism of psychological and physical control, leaving no room for error or hesitation. Those who had begun to question, to investigate, or to approach the truth were met with unmistakable brutality. Threats were not whispered, they were demonstrated. Local informants vanished, wagons were set ablaze, and messages were left in places meant to be seen but not traced, showing the predator's omnipotence. Fear was no longer just a tool for controlling captives, it became a weapon against anyone who dared encroach upon her empire. Even within her network, enforcement was uncompromising. Disloyalty, mistakes, or hesitation were punished swiftly, often violently. This ruthlessness ensured unwavering obedience, creating a system where accomplices internalized fear as loyalty. Each act of punishment reinforced the predator's dominance, making her empire function like a living organism, every part aware of its role and consequences of failure. The escalation of violence served another purpose. It masked the growing pressure from authorities. By increasing chaos and unpredictability, she diverted attention from patterns investigators might have otherwise discerned. The predator understood human psychology intimately. Terror could cloud judgment, fragment communities, and paralyze action. In this way, fear became not just protection, but camouflage, a cloak for the expansion of her operations. The empire, once hidden, now projected power. Communities whispered of a woman whose reach was limitless, whose wrath was immediate, and whose cunning was unmatched. Even those far removed from the borderlands spoke in hushed tones of her deeds, knowing that her reputation alone demanded obedience. Through calculated escalation, the predator demonstrated the terrifying intersection of intelligence, brutality, and psychological mastery. She was no longer merely evading justice. She was shaping the world around her to serve her will, and anyone who underestimated her would learn that her empire thrived on fear, precision, and relentless adaptability. Even the most tightly controlled empire is vulnerable to betrayal, and the predator soon discovered that loyalty can be fragile when fear is constant. One of her trusted associates, a man responsible for coordinating transport and safe houses, began covertly feeding information to authorities. It was a subtle act, almost invisible, but the predator's instincts sensed it immediately. A slight hesitation, a misstep, a whisper in the wrong ear. The discovery was handled with surgical precision. Unlike external threats, internal betrayal demanded more than brute force. It required demonstration of absolute control. The predator did not merely punish the traitor. She made an example, ensuring that every member of her network understood the consequences of disloyalty. The punishment was both psychological and physical, calculated to instill terror while reinforcing her supremacy. Rumors of the act spread quickly within the network. Whispered accounts of the traitor's fate became a form of psychological warfare, a constant reminder that the predator's eyes were everywhere, her judgment final. Loyalty was no longer optional. It was survival. Every accomplice now moved with heightened awareness, understanding that even minor failures or questionable intentions could result in swift and unforgiving retribution. The betrayal also revealed another truth. The predator was adaptable. She altered communication methods, adjusted procedures, and implemented redundancies to prevent future breaches. Her network became more sophisticated, more compartmentalized, and more resilient. By turning betrayal into a catalyst for improvement, she transformed a potential weakness into a mechanism for strengthening control. Victims, too, were not immune to the ripple effects of internal dissent. Any hint that an authority might be approaching triggered increased vigilance and stricter confinement. Those already broken psychologically were reminded, often through staged demonstrations of power, that obedience remained their only means of survival. Fear, carefully directed, ensured that both captives and collaborators were equally compliant. This episode marked a critical moment in the Predator's reign. It revealed the delicate balance between control and chaos, and how mastery over human behavior demanded both calculation and cruelty. By neutralizing betrayal and reinforcing obedience, she secured her empire against internal decay, ensuring that her operations continued uninterrupted, her reach unchallenged, and her legend, one of fear, cunning, and ruthless authority, only grew darker. The Predator understood that true power extended beyond walls and chains. It required mastery over perception. She expanded her influence outward, manipulating both local communities and regional authorities with the same ruthless precision she used to control her captives. Every gesture, every message, every transaction was a calculated move on a chessboard she alone could see in full. Authorities, already frustrated by jurisdictional confusion, were now subtly redirected by her machinations. Reports of suspicious activity were delayed, misfiled, or dismissed. Couriers carrying intelligence were intercepted or misled. She ensured that those who sought justice were kept perpetually off balance, chasing shadows while she expanded her operations under their noses. Her empire thrived in the gaps of law enforcement, exploiting every weakness, every bureaucratic delay, and every distracted official. Communities, too, were instruments of control. Merchants, tavern owners, and neighbors who might have resisted were subtly coerced or bribed, creating a network of passive enablers. Fear was omnipresent. Those who asked questions too loudly risked social ostracization, economic retaliation, or more direct consequences. Even those who silently observed were, in a sense, complicit, their inaction reinforcing her dominance. She was a master of duality. To the outside world, she appeared as a shrewd, if formidable, landowner, strategic, commanding, but not overtly criminal. Beneath that facade, she orchestrated abductions, trafficking, and murder with methodical precision. The Predator's genius lay in her ability to exist in both realms simultaneously, respected, feared, and underestimated by those with the power to challenge her. Every expansion was calculated. New safe houses were established in towns previously untouched by her network, each location vetted for isolation, lawyer, LTI, and opportunity. Couriers and scouts ensured information moved swiftly while minimizing risk. The Predator's vision was not limited to a single border or jurisdiction. It spanned states, communities, and systems, creating a web of control that was both vast and invisible. By manipulating authorities and embedding herself within communities, the Predator transformed fear into infrastructure, turning the very society that might have resisted her into an unwitting instrument of her empire. Every action, every omission, every whispered warning strengthened her position. She demonstrated that true mastery is not just domination of the weak. It is the subtle, invisible control over the strong, the compliant, and the indifferent alike. The Predator's empire, long hidden in shadows and silence, began to fracture when the first public records hinted at her deeds. Court documents, burial records, and investigative notes emerged, revealing fragments of abductions, disappearances, and murders. Though incomplete, the revelations sent a shockwave through the communities that had long whispered of her presence. It was the careful accumulation of evidence that first drew attention. Witness testimonies, often extracted under duress or fear, began to paint a portrait of an operation far more organized and deadly than anyone had imagined. Names, dates, and locations formed a chilling pattern connecting isolated incidents into a single narrative of terror. The Predator, once untouchable, was now visible, not yet captured, but unmistakably real. The public response was a mixture of horror, disbelief, and fascination. Newspapers cautiously reported on the case, hinting at atrocities without fully naming the predator. The strategic ambiguity ensured that fear spread without providing a clear target, amplifying the mythos surrounding her. Families who had lost loved ones found their suspicions validated, yet the predator's reach still rendered direct confrontation impossible. Investigators faced a paradox. Every document uncovered illuminated the scale of her crimes, but also demonstrated how adeptly she had manipulated records, witnesses, and legal systems. Gaps and inconsistencies in the evidence were not oversights. They were deliberate, a reflection of the predator's foresight in exploiting human and institutional weaknesses. Her ability to control narratives extended beyond her immediate network, reaching into the very mechanisms meant to check her power. For her captives, the emerging records were a double-edged revelation. On one hand, they offered hope. The predator was not invisible, and there were those who sought to bring justice. On the other, the knowledge of how meticulous and far-reaching her network was reinforced the depth of control she wielded. Fear, obedience, and psychological manipulation had created a near-perfect ecosystem for the predator to thrive within. The exposure also marked a turning point in the predator's behavior. With attention growing, she became more strategic, more ruthless, and more theatrical in enforcing dominance. Each revelation fueled her empire, reinforcing her legend as an untouchable force. The public records were not just documents, they were markers of fear, tools in a psychological war, and testimony to the predator's unparalleled mastery over human systems and human minds alike. The predator understood a principle few others grasped. Attention can be as dangerous as it is useful. With public records beginning to expose fragments of her empire, she transformed scrutiny into an instrument of power. Fear was amplified not by secrecy alone, but by the perception of omnipotence, the idea that she could act anywhere, at any time, and remain untouchable. She used misinformation to control what investigators and the public believed. False leads were planted, rumors seeded, and witnesses subtly intimidated to shape the narrative. Couriers carrying documents were intercepted, evidence disappeared or appeared altered. The predator had learned that reality could be manipulated just like people, by carefully choosing what to reveal, what to hide, and what to exaggerate. Communities, now aware of investigations, became instruments of indirect control. By allowing fear to permeate households, she ensured vigilance became self-policing. Neighbors whispered warnings, children were kept indoors, and merchants watched every transaction. This collective anxiety worked in her favor, tightening her grip without direct action. Every rumor, every fearful glance reinforced the predator's mythos, creating an invisible network of compliance that extended far beyond her immediate operations. Within her network, the predator intensified loyalty through spectacle. Betrayals were exposed and punished publicly, demonstrating both her awareness and her capacity for ruthless enforcement. Compliance was no longer enforced solely by fear of death. It became a psychological architecture of survival. Every participant internalized the predator's dominance, believing that failure was not just dangerous, but impossible. The predator also exploited authorities directly. Lawmen frustrated by gaps in evidence were misled, diverted, or delayed. By creating illusions of progress where none existed, she manipulated perception, ensuring investigators believed they were closer to uncovering her empire than they truly were. Confidence was an illusion, control was real. Through these strategies, the predator converted scrutiny into advantage. She turned every observer into a tool, every whisper into reinforcement, and every assumption into obedience. Her empire became not only a network of abduction and terror, but also a psychological machine, finely tuned to extract obedience, fear, and compliance from everyone within its sphere. In this way, the predator demonstrated a terrifying mastery over both the tangible and intangible, over bodies, minds, systems, and perception itself. To challenge her was to challenge reality, to confront not just a person, but an idea, a pervasive force of manipulation, control, and unyielding power. The predator's dominion was not limited to captives or her immediate network. It seeped into the very fabric of the surrounding communities. Families of the missing were subjected to an insidious terror, one that operated quietly, invisibly, and relentlessly. Even when she did not act directly, the predator ensured that fear filled the spaces between people, shaping behavior as effectively as chains and locks ever could. Letters sent to authorities went unanswered. Rumors of disappearances circulated like shadowed folklore, and neighbors remained suspicious yet silent. Every unresolved abduction served as a tool for psychological control, teaching the community that intervention carried risk, and curiosity could lead to danger. Parents learned not only to protect their children, but also to obey the unspoken rules of silence and compliance. Victims' families were manipulated into paralysis. The predator orchestrated moments that seemed coincidental, wagons passing near homes at night, fleeting sightings of strangers in the woods, or cryptic warnings from local residents. These calculated interactions generated uncertainty, doubt, and a pervasive sense of vulnerability. Families could neither ignore the threat nor confront it directly. They became prisoners of their own fear. Within the predator's network, this manipulation was mirrored. Accomplices were reminded daily that defiance was fatal, yet participation in the operation's outward-facing aspects, delivery, observation, or misinformation, was framed as survival. Fear was leveraged into loyalty. Terror became a currency exchanged for life itself. Each person internalized the predator's control, creating a network of willing enforcers who propagated her influence beyond physical boundaries. This psychological reach transformed the predator from a criminal into a legend, an omnipresent force whose power could be felt, but rarely seen. Every disappearance, every unexplained movement, every whispered account contributed to the collective consciousness of fear. Communities adapted to her presence, unconsciously collaborating with the architecture of control she had constructed. By extending manipulation into social systems and family structures, the predator ensured that her empire was both self-sustaining and adaptive. Obedience was maintained not just through chains or threats, but through anticipation, uncertainty, and pervasive dread. Fear became normalized, embedded within daily life, and internalized as instinct. Through this, she demonstrated a terrifying mastery, not only over individuals, but over the psyche of entire communities. As investigators began piecing together the fragments of her empire, the predator recognized the imminent threat, not as panic, but as opportunity. Every inquiry, every trail followed, was an invitation to demonstrate mastery. She engaged in a subtle dance with law enforcement, allowing glimpses of her network while masking its true scale. Each confrontation was calculated to intimidate, mislead, and assert dominance. When authorities approached, they found misdirection at every turn. Safe houses appeared abandoned or normal. Witnesses were recalcitrant or vanished. Evidence was contradictory, incomplete, or deliberately obscured. The predator had transformed investigation into theater. Lawmen were not just frustrated, they were puppets in her design, compelled to follow paths of her choosing. Each step they took further reinforced her omnipotence in the shadows. Her internal network responded with precision. Every member understood the importance of secrecy, misdirection, and loyalty under pressure. The predator's earlier lessons in fear, betrayal, and obedience crystallized into a sophisticated system, a living, adaptive organism capable of responding to scrutiny with agility and lethal efficiency. Any hint of exposure was countered immediately, leaving investigators chasing illusions while the predator expanded her operations with impunity. Communities, already steeped in fear, became unwitting collaborators. Observers hesitated, rumors amplified the predator's mythos, and ordinary citizens internalized the cautionary narrative of her power. Even those outside her direct influence acted in ways that protected her enterprise. Through psychological manipulation, perception management, and calculated intimidation, the predator turned the attention of the authorities into a tool to further consolidate control. This confrontation also demonstrated her strategic brilliance. The predator recognized that survival required evolution. She refined transportation routes, altered operational patterns, and developed contingency plans for every scenario. Exposure was not merely a risk. It was an instrument to strengthen the resilience of her empire. Fear, obedience, and manipulation became intertwined, reinforcing the predator's supremacy at every level. In this intricate interplay between visibility and concealment, the predator's true power became apparent. She was not simply evading justice, she was orchestrating it. Every investigation, every attempt at interference, only deepened the legend of her omnipotence. The predator had become more than a criminal. She was a force, a presence, a system of control operating beyond the reach of conventional authority, untouchable yet terrifyingly tangible. The predator's empire did not end with her capture or death. It lingered in the shadows, woven into the very psyche of the communities, families, and survivors she had manipulated. Her reign left an indelible mark, a blueprint for terror that persisted long after physical chains were removed. Fear had become institutionalized, normalized, and internalized. Every disappearance, every whisper, every shadowed glance was a reminder of the predator's lasting influence. Even historians and investigators years later struggle to reconcile the scope of her operations. Court documents, testimonies, and burial records only scratched the surface, revealing fragments of an intelligence network that had preyed upon the vulnerable while exploiting every weakness in law, society, and human psychology. The predator had demonstrated that true power extends beyond brutality. It is the art of shaping perception, controlling narrative, and bending society to one's will without overt confrontation. Her captives, survivors of abduction and terror, carried the weight of her control within them. Trauma etched deep lines in memory and behavior. Caution became instinct. Vigilance became second nature. Families, once targets, adapted to a world where the predator's legacy remained a silent instruction: trust no one, fear everything, and understand that evil can operate without exposure or punishment. The lessons she left behind were chillingly precise. The predator's story also serves as a reflection on the human condition, on the capacity for cunning, cruelty, and control to flourish in the spaces society neglects. She exploited gaps in law, prejudice, and indifference, proving that power can be absolute when reinforced by manipulation and terror. Her empire was a demonstration of psychological mastery, a system where fear, loyalty, and obedience intertwined to create unstoppable momentum. As we look back, the predator's legacy is not merely historical, it is cautionary. It reveals how empires of control are built, maintained, and remembered. It challenges us to recognize the systems around us, the invisible forces that shape behavior, and the consequences of inaction. The predator's reign is a mirror, reflecting both the darkest capabilities of one individual and the vulnerabilities of an entire society. And as you sit with this knowledge, understanding the predator's reach and cunning, reflect on this. The most dangerous power is not the one you see, but the one you cannot see, the one operating silently, calculating, and always watching. For those who learn the truth, the world is never quite the same. Fear becomes awareness. Awareness becomes vigilance. And the memory of the predator, her control, her ruthlessness, her legacy remains